This conference will now be recorded.
So I decided to put together a video for a quick review for people who have either forgotten things from last semester or if they didn't take the first semester of Greek. So we're going to go through quickly the pronunciation of these different letters. This will be fairly brief, and the idea is to be used as a reference whenever you forget something or need to go back and review before we start getting into the more deep things. So the first thing we're going to start out with is how to write the letters and their names and the sounds that they make. So the first one here is alpha. Alpha is drawn by starting up here at the halfway point, coming down, swinging back around, and making somewhat of a fish shape. Alpha makes the sound of the A in father. Next letter is beta. With beta, there's kind of two ways to do it. You can either start down here and come up like that. That's the way I normally make it. You can do it the opposite way. I just tend to not have as much control. Beta makes the B sound as in boy. The next letter here is gamma. Gamma is drawn like that. Gamma makes the G sound as in go. Next is the delta. The delta is another one that you can kind of do two different ways. I start up here, come back, swing around, do like that. So kind of like an S, and then add this circle to it. Another way you can do it is sort of the opposite of that. I just have difficulty doing that. Delta makes the D sound as in dog. The next letter here is epsilon. Epsilon is sort of like a backward 3, so if you do that, turn that around. Also similar to the cursive uppercase E. Epsilon is the short E sound as in egg. Next is zeta. The way that I was taught to make a zeta was you make the loop first, come down around the back. I have seen people who break it down in sort of the parts, so you can start out with a C, then you add the little tail here and the flourish there. For me, it's just easier to go through it like that. So zeta, think of it as the Z sound. If you pronounce it like a Z, no one's going to judge you for that. The technical way that you're supposed to pronounce it is this DZ sound is in ads. Or I guess the other way you could do it is that sound. The idea is you put your tongue at the roof of your mouth like you're going to make a D, duh, but instead a Z comes out, the. And the roof of your mouth behind your teeth. Next is eta. Eta kind of is like an N, except you come down below the line, like that. Eta is the Greek long E sound, but it sounds like the E in 8. Or they, that's the one people usually point to. It's the reason I say it's an E sound is because there's a couple times where we'll talk about changes, and they usually follow an E pattern rather than an A pattern. It's more of a grammar thing. You're usually going to end up just memorizing it, but it's more for completeness' sake. Next is theta. So theta, you have this oval, goes a little bit above the midpoint, and then a line across. Theta is the TH sound as in thought. Okay. Next is iota. Iota is an I without the dot. I without the dot. Um, the kind of confusing thing is you're going to notice that a lot of times it's going to be accented, so it's going to look like it has a dot, but unless it has the accent on it, it's not supposed to have that. Iota it usually ends up having a an I sound like in well, kind of like this I with grieve. There are times where it will have a short I like igloo. I'd say that's probably the exception. This is one that can have kind of two different sounds depending on the particular word we're talking about. It's going to have more of the E sound whenever it's at the end of a syllable. Next is kappa. Kappa is the K sound, as in, well, both of these would be the K sound that's the kappa would make. Most, and Greek's one of them, most languages don't have two different sounds that make that K sound. Greek only has one. One thing that you can do to remember this is the word cardia. Cardia. This is the word we get cardiology from. It means heart. So either, usually when it's transliterated, you go with the K, but just so you understand that many words in English come from the same root and are spelled with a C. Next is the lambda. Lambda is made with one mark and then kind of a kickstand to put it down, like that. Lambda makes the L sound, as in well. Mu, kind of like a U that you start below the line. The way I remembered this when I was learning it, if you took the mu and you can kind of do it sloppy like this one, it ends up looking like an M. So mu is the M sound, as in mother. Next is nu. So whenever you're writing this, it's very important that you have a sharp point at the bottom of it. Okay. The rest of it isn't quite as important. I mean, if you did this, I don't think anybody's going to fault, but you want to have that sharp point. The reason for that is to distinguish a nu from an upsilon, because an upsilon makes a U sound, a nu makes an N sound, as in noon. All right, the next one is Xi. So you make a Xi starting off sort of like you did with the zeta, but instead you make two of these little flourishes. Messed it up. Okay. Easy for me to do. So Xi makes the X, Y sound. So the way that I tell people is like the word boxy, it's that sound. Not a very common letter for what it's worth. Yeah, that's really all I have to say about it. Not as common as some of the other ones. The biggest thing that you're going to see is that whenever certain letters come together, one that comes to mind is kappa plus sigma, you end up getting a C. And almost all the times it occurs is whenever one of these contractions has happened. I can think of just a couple words that have it in it naturally. Okay, next is Omicron. Omicron is just like our O. It is the short O sound, and it's the O as in it's the best example would be something like sob. Next is P. Yes, in math it's pi, but in Greek it is P, just like our P. Makes the same, just like P. So the P as in pop. Combining with our last one, you phonetically spell that, pop. Next letter is Rho. You can kind of do it either way, either from the top or from the bottom. Rho is the R sound. It's the same R that you would find in roll. Next is sigma. Sigma has two forms. Usually you start on the right, drag this back, come down and around. You can do it the other way too. So sigma is made this way whenever it's in the middle of a sentence or the beginning of a sentence. Sigma can also be this way. So this is kind of like an S that's way too big on the top, or a C that you have a tail on. So this is S or sigma at the end of a sentence. Okay, so sigma makes the S sound as in class. Next is tau or ta, depending on what your teacher told you. I've heard it pronounced both ways. Ta is the T sound, as in toga. Very Greek. Next is the one I mentioned before, is upsilon. Upsilon is going to almost always be the long U. So the U as in Uber is a very common way to describe it. The big thing, once again, is you want the curve on the bottom of this one. So nu has a sharp point to it. Upsilon has a rounded bottom to it. So you can do this however you want. Kind of the needed parts are the sharp point with the nu, and you need some sort of thing at the beginning. All right, this is two different ways to do a phi. A phi has the PH sound as in phone. And this is two different ways to do it. This first one is sort of a almost like cursive, where you're writing it fast. You come down, around, back up, and down. This other one is a little bit more simple, but takes a little bit longer to print it. So it's a circle with a line through it. If I'm doing something, just being transparent, if I'm doing something that I have to turn into somebody, I usually will write it like this. If I'm doing something where I'm just taking notes for myself, I'll usually write it like this. Next one is the key. So the key has, I don't know if it's coming through the recording that well, kind of a rough sound at the beginning where you're more or less swallowing your spit, sort of a guttural sound. So the key. So the key is made very similar to an X, except it falls below the line. And you'll notice here that the first leg has the curves on both sides, and then a straight line over. So they both end up falling below the line. Okay. So the key is usually going to be we're usually going to use the CH sound. Technically, it's the CH sound like you would hear in Bach. So there's a little bit of a guttural part to it. More important than pronunciation is knowing how you transliterate it and use the CH. Next one is C. C is kind of like this wide U with a line down the middle. You get sort of a trident looking thing. So the C has a PS sound, like in lips. Kind of like going back to the C. Remember how I said that this is often going to be kappa plus sigma equals C? In the same way, P plus sigma is often going to be C. The last letter is omega. So omega, you can either do a loop with it or just a regular kind of W. Omega is the longo sound. So it's the O as in bone. Okay, just kind of a note here. Omicron is always short. Omega is always long. Epsilon is always short. Eta is always long. The rest of them can be either short or long depending on the context. Most of the time, I'm going to be pronouncing the words for you so that you hear them at least once so you'll know how they're pronounced beforehand. But there's a couple different rules, and you can look in your text that goes over all the rules about exactly how you're supposed to syllabalize and pronounce certain things and how often they will be kind of the rules for them. Most of the time, if you just pay attention and hear it a few times, that's going to be more helpful than learning the rules, because the rules are somewhat subjective and there's exceptions to the rules. You'll find yourself trying to figure out why it's one way versus the other. And we're not going to be speaking this language, at least not with the pronunciations I'm teaching you, the Erasmian pronunciations. This language, you couldn't go over to Greece and speak this language and anyone know what you're talking about, with a few exceptions. But the Greek that they speak now is different. So the way that you pronounce these are more or less lost, and really understanding the meaning is more important than being able to pronounce them anyway. All right, I'm going to move into some punctuation and syllabication, just kind of, like I said, to briefly overview this. So the period and the comma are the same as English. Same. A semicolon is, instead of looking like this as it is in English, it's one dot above the line. The other thing is they tend to use this a lot more than we use semicolons in English. The question mark in Greek is the semicolon in English. So see right here. They don't have a question mark. They just use the semicolon. All right, so kind of going through this. This would be the end of a statement. So this is the period, the comma, the semicolon, and a question mark. This goes through the diacriticals. So the diaeresis, we're not going to see this very often at all. In all of the examples I can think of in the New Testament are actually Old Testament names that have been transliterated into Greek. So a diaeresis is if you have two letters that are next to each other that normally would blend together and make something called a diphthong. If you have this above them, these two dots, this means you pronounce them separately. Like I said, the only things I can think of off my head are like certain spellings of Moses have this diacritical mark. It's not terribly common. And apostrophe means more or less the same thing it does in English, that there's been some letters dropped out. You can see here that the Omicron has been dropped off of this particular word. The accents have more or less been they've more or less been lost exactly what they mean. There's some thought that there was some almost like tonal aspects of problem. You can see that it's useful. It's what originally pronounced the grave. And it has to do with it. Loss is the circumflex, so it is like a tilde. Spanish, we drew don't. What this one was is that it went up and then. Thought was that it went up and then down. So as it was represented. So increase in pitch, decrease in pitch, up and down. Really, for our situation, you just need to know to stress the syllable that has the different accent mark on it. So he's kind of put down here for debate. Pronunciation, maybe it has something to do with it. For memorization, it's important. For identification, it's important. So there's certain words that the only thing that's different between them is the accent mark. So you do need to pay attention to them. Most of the time, there are things that I will tell you, hey, you need to know that the only difference here is the accent mark. All right. You can kind of see here, there are some rules that go along with these, and if anybody would like, I can explain the different rules, but the main thing you need to know is to stress that syllable. So it's aiteo, theos, agnos. So you're putting the emphasis on whichever one has the accent on it. Aiteo, theos, hagnos. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. The syllabification, you can learn the rules. They're in the appendix. But really, if you just listen to your teacher, for an English speaker, they're pretty easy to pick up on. These are the rules. If there's one vowel per syllable. Single consonant by itself goes to the following. Two consecutive vowels that do not form a diphthong are divided. Consonant cluster that cannot be pronounced together is divided. Consonant cluster that can be pronounced together goes with the following. Double consonants are divided. Compound words are divided where they're joined. And that's his rules. There's a couple other ones if you look at a few different things, but that pretty much will take care of it. If you want to learn the rules, really most of the time you are going to just listen to me or somebody else that you're studying with pronounce them and learn them that way. All right, so we're going to learn some vocabularies. You can see here that we're going to learn about 80% of the vocabulary of the New Testament by learning 319 words, which is really not that much for learning a language. Most languages you have to learn 5,000 words the first semester. By learning 319 words, you're going to know 80% of the vocabulary of the New Testament. It's pretty good. And he points this out. We're going to learn the glosses, which is, for example, adelphos is brother. In plural, it can mean brothers and sisters. So the definitions, it kind of puts in here, there's a couple of different things that it can mean. All right, so here's the vocabulary. So I'm going to go through, if there's a couple odd things. I'm going to point them out. So the first one has one. So this is angelos. Angelos has something called a gamma nasal, which is right here. If two gammas, so if you have a gamma gamma, a gamma kappa, a gamma xi, or a gamma chi or a gamma xi. I said it right, but drew it wrong. The gamma in front is pronounced like an N. Okay, so that's why it's angelos. Angelos means angel or messenger. Amen. Amen means amen, truly, so let it be, verily. Anthropos. Anthropos means man, person, certain man, a certain person. Probably most of the time you're going to look at it this way. It can also mean woman in certain instances, but there's some changes that happen for that to happen. But generally, this means person. It can also mean mankind, spoken of as a broader term. Apostolos. Apostolos means apostle. And just so that we're clear, apostle means one who is sent. Okay, so it can be either the office or it can mean roughly the same as missionary. Galileia. Galileia means Galilee. You'll see the diphthong here. It's pronounced like the AI in aisle. Graphe. Graphe can mean writings, scripture, and sometimes can mean Bible. Doxa. Doxa means glory or majesty. Ego. Ego means I. If you heard the word ego, this is where it comes from. Eschatos. Eschatos. Eschatos means last. If you've heard the word eschatology, which is the study of last things, this is where it comes from. Eschatos. Zoe. Zoe means life. It's where we get the name Zoe from. Theos. Theos means God, God, divine, things along those lines. Kai. Kai means and or also. Kai is the most common word besides the article in the Greek New Testament. It has a very fluid meaning. Sometimes it can mean something as simple as a comma. So the commas that we see in the Greek New Testament are things that have been added later. Sometimes when Paul is writing something very long, I'm thinking about the kind of introduction that he gives in Ephesians, talking about Jesus, where it's the longest single sentence in the Greek language. He uses a lot of kais, and he doesn't use them to mean necessarily and. It's more used as a marker to divide the sentence up. So context is really going to guide you exactly how it needs to be translated in each sentence. Cardia, I mentioned this one earlier. Cardia means heart. It's where we get cardiology from. Cosmos. Cosmos means world, but it can also mean the cosmos, the universe. Logos. Logos means word, the word. And it can also mean statement, idea. If I remember right, I think there's 23 accepted definitions for logos in BDAG. And I know one of the big things is that a logos exists without being spoken. So it's not necessarily the word itself, the speaking of it, it's the content of it. That's more Greek exegesis type things, but just so you understand, there's kind of, when we say word, that's pretty limited as to exactly what this word means exclusively. At some point, I think Luke and I are going to do some readings from Philo, and Philo talks about this a lot. And Philo talks about this idea independent of Jesus, which makes it even more interesting. So he uses this idea as kind of God's dominion and those sort of things. This is a very broad, and it's very common in Greek philosophy to see this word. So you see here, you start with a P. In Greek, you're not supposed to have any letters that don't have a sound. So you're really supposed to say this pneuma, but we aren't really used to starting the words with a P. So many people just say pneuma, but this is the word for wind or spirit. Can also be the big S, spirit, depending on the context. It's where we get the word pneumonia from, or pneumothorax, and all sorts of words that have to do with losing your wind. That's where it comes from. Prophetes. Prophetes means prophet. Sabbaton. Sabbaton means Sabbath. It can also mean week. Phone. Phone means sound or voice. It's where we get all the things with phone on them. Telephone, microphone, all those things come from this word. Christos. Christos means Christ or Messiah, anointed one. Abraham. You notice we syllabilize between the two alphas. Abraham is Abraham. Dawid. Dawid is David. Paulos. Paulos is Paul. Petros. Petros is Peter. As we all know, that also means rock or stone. Pilotos. Pilotos means pilot. This is a long A here. You know that because it has the circumflex over the top of it, and the circumflex can only be over long letters. Simone. Simone is Simon. So by learning these 26 words, you already know 11% of the vocabulary using the Greek New Testament. You're going to see that with, I wouldn't say no effort, but with putting to memory a fairly few number of words, you're going to end up having a pretty broad vocabulary. So right now, if you were to take out a Greek New Testament, you could go through it and you'd be able to identify more than 1 in 10 words, which is kind of cool, that you're already to the point where you know over 10% of the Greek vocabulary just by memorizing those I went through briefly. All right. Hopefully this acted as a good review, and you can use it as a reference to go back to if you forget something. I'm confident that you'll get this down probably after watching this video just a couple times.